Okay, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon or morning, depending where you are in the world. Welcome to part 2 of our series on key moments that have shaped Israel. We're very fortunate to have with us this evening an old friend, former boss of mine, in fact. I'll say a few words about him in a minute. Before I formally introduce him, I want to welcome newcomers to this series and newcomers to the Begin Center's Zoom sessions in English. We've been doing this now for several months. We've had a number of fantastic lectures and speakers and discussions on a number of topics around Israeli history and politics and Zionism, anti-Semitism. We've covered a lot of areas, and we're now, as I said, into a new series that we're looking at different events that have shaped Israeli society and Israeli politics over the history of the state. Last week, we looked at the Six-Day War. We are now looking 10 years further on from that, from 1967 to 1977, and what's known in Hebrew as the Mahapach. There's no great translation in English, but usually referred to as the upheaval or the turnabout or some such, but essentially the dramatic change in Israeli politics, which saw 29 years of rule by the labor movement of Ben Gurion and Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin overturned, and the Likud come to power with Menachem Begin. We're going to be looking very specifically not at some of the topics that we've already discussed in previous lectures when we've heard about Menachem Begin, some of the more sort of the big sort of global headline grabbers around bombing the nuclear reactor in Iraq and peace with Egypt, but rather at domestic Israel, and really the things that have in many ways been most impactful here in Israel, which is the revolution in economy and socioeconomic policy that Menachem Begin brought to bear in Israel. Just before I introduce our speaker, for those that are new to this, you can ask questions of our speaker by writing them into the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and I will read those out at the end of his presentation. I will now introduce our speaker and we will get moving. So, very fortunate, very honored to have with me this evening, Dr. Moshe Fuksmann-Shaal, someone I know very well personally. He is a former deputy head of the Begin Center and a former boss of mine, and now just a good friend. You can't tell me what to do anymore. You can try. Since leaving the Begin Center, he is the director of the Knesset Museum, the formative Knesset Museum that will be housed in the old Knesset building on King George Street, for those that are familiar with Jerusalem and know that old building where the Knesset used to be before it moved to its current place. He's a lecturer at Hadassah Academic College with a PhD in political history from Tel Aviv University. And he's really one of Israel's experts on this particular topic, specifically the economic and socioeconomic policy of Menachem Begin and the Likud government that came into power in 1977. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Dr. Moshe Fuksmann-Shaal.
Thank you very much, Paul. I will try to do the share screening so I can, yeah, great. One second. Take out this Zoom here and okay. So one second now. Okay. So I want to start. I don't see myself. So 1 second. Let's see if I see myself here. Never mind. I hope everybody else see me because I don't see myself. But so I want to start with a short phrase from Milton Friedman, I hope that everybody knows him. He is the Nobel Prize laureate for economics in '76. And he known for many people as the man who is Mr. Capitalism or Mr. Free Market. And he had enormous effect both on the Thatcher government, both on Ronald Reagan government and so on. And in 1977, that we are dealing with, this political turnover, he wrote an article just a few weeks after the election, and he wrote about this election, and he wrote that the 2,000 years old Jewish tradition of self-reliance and voluntary cooperation, of getting around government control, of using every device of Jewish ingenuity to take advantage of such opportunities as escaped the clumsy grasp of government officials, had won over public opinion in a struggle against 100 years old tradition of faith in paternalistic socialist regime, which had rejected the free market and capitalism. So if we are dealing with this election of '77, I don't think it's an ordinary election that one party takes over the other party, but it's actually, as Milton Friedman says, it was a very important moment in the history of the State of Israel, and even in the Jewish people history. You know, Milton Friedman used to say that there aren't any other nation like the Jews that so benefited the free market and capitalism, yet try all the time to undermine the system. And for Milton Friedman, the Jews and Israel itself as the Jewish country, it was an important example. And I think also it's another important fact is that in '77, after almost 30 years of socialist parties of the labor in power, first time that a right-wing party is being elected to government. And in '79, but this has opened a series of elections. In '79, we can see Margaret Thatcher voted in Britain after almost 15 years of labor governments. And in 1980, we see the Reagan being elected. And also with the same, I would say there is very similar lines between all those three parties of new spirit of free market capitalism, of really changing the economy. And in 1977, actually, Israel just opened, I would say, this whole process. And we were the first, and as Milton Friedman noticed, it wasn't just an election, not only just in Israel, not only in our area, but it also had an impact and also, I would say, predicted a lot of other, predicted this process of change in the whole world.
Moshe,
yes.
Can I just ask, we had a request, can you switch the Matseget to presentation mode at the bottom?
Yes. Oh, of course.
Just so it's a bit bigger.
Yeah, that's it.
Great.
I'm sorry. And the other thing that I brought you an ad from 1977. And this is an ad that was published by Labor a few days before the election. And in this ad, actually, Labor described the Likud as the Roman god Janus that had two faces. Because they say the Likud is like this Roman god Janus that has one face that is go to liberal and free market and economy, and the other face is speaking about the poor people and about helping the poor people, and one face is speaking about helping the industrial, the industry and the entrepreneurs and so on. And actually, when they said for, as like something bad with the Likud, but it actually had a point there about the Likud himself as a party. And I brought you some ads. This is the headlines of the Likud and Herut newspaper. And you see on one hand, they're speaking about social justice. And on the other hand, they speak about freedom of the individual. And also in the second ad that I brought you of Herut, on one side, they're saying we are against economic monopoly and free market. And on the other hand, we are for social justice. That means that the Likud, I would say until '77, and you will see it, had like two heads of it. And the reason is because the Likud has identified itself and the Herut before it, Herut party, as a liberal nationalism. That's mean on the one hand, they are liberal and they are the freedom of the individual, and the other hand, nationalism looking at repairing the society. And as freedom of the individual, this is what Menachem Begin used to say, that freedom of the individual is has like three parts. The first one is the mental freedom or the spiritual freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. Second one is the political freedom, freedom to make a party, to demonstrate, for instance, if we're speaking about our current days. But there is another part, which is the economic freedom. And the economic freedom was very important to achieve this freedom of the individual in Israel. And in order to achieve it, you can see this ad. 1 second, I found it a little bit here. Okay, I can see. Okay. And you can see this ad that I bought, the ad from, I think it's the first or second election. And you can see how Herut, what we call the father of the Likud, the Herut party headed by Menachem Begin, how it sees Mapai. And it sees Mapai before the states benefiting from all of the taxes and all of the actually contribution and all of the support that he got from Jews all over the world, the entrepreneurs, free market, very wealthy Jews that gave support in order to establish the state. And afterwards, Mapai became this big bully with two sticks, one saying they are going to destroy the middle class, and the other one saying, I'm going to destroy the private initiative. And actually, I have to say that in those years, until 77 or until 1985, you have to bear in mind that Israel was the closest model to the Soviet Union or the East in all the West. That means that we had almost 70 to 80% of the working force worked either for factories that owned by the government or by the working union. The working union had a lot of factories, what we called Chevrat Avdim, and it was a big sector. I think here we've been the closest model, economic model to the Soviet Union from all the West. And you can see here one of the members of the Knesset of the Herut saying, there is a sector of this country which is being constantly ruined. We must set out to defend the middle class. That means that Herut saw itself, first of all, defending the middle class against the labor. And I brought you some pictures of the labor, how the labor actually saw the middle class. It's not just something that Herut had in mind, but actually you can see the role model of the Israeli of those years, how labor saw it. You can see it on the left, the young working guy holding this big hammer, of course, with this red background. And on the other side, we can see how they look at their opponents from the right. This big fat guy with jewelry eating pineapple. Even in those times, it was very expensive, not only in our times, and drinking expensive wine while the workers are working and so on. And you can see here, I brought you a quote about the importance of private capital that Menachem Begin always said. Menachem Begin and Herut, what we call then, as I said again, the right in those times, the political right. So first of all, bringing the capital, private capital to Israel as the way to break the labor hold on the economy and also on the government. Because by controlling the factories, if you didn't have this red, we call it this red booklet of saying that you are a part of this party, the red card, that you are a part of labor, you couldn't find work in most of those factories. And if you wanted to enter those factories and you already admitted, you had to be an active members of the party in order to advance in this factory in order to get in a higher position in this factory. So they understood that the bringing capital was the first thing, the most important thing. And how do you bring this capital? So of course, first of all, they wanted to break the government control over the exchange rate. And you can see again, Menachem Begin, the termination of government control in order to determine the exchange rate, would lead Israel to becoming the Jewish Switzerland, an international bank. And they understood that in order that there will be foreign capital and there will be private capital entering Israel, you need, first of all, the lira. Then it was lira, afterward it became shekel, also something Begin did, because he said that the lira was an English currency that we took until about 1980, and he introduced the shekel as an Israeli national currency, but at those times it was the lira, and the government had all kinds of exchange rate for tourism, for industry, and so on, and actually nobody in the world treated the Israeli lira as a currency that you can pay with, because they knew that it was like a monopoly. This money was artificially, the current of the currency was artificially being controlled by the government, and it was a problem in order if you want to bring capital from abroad. Another thing, the monopolies. Israel until the 80s was very controlled by what we call the government and the working union monopolies. Of course, they were quite, I would say, an obstacle if you want to have a free economy, a free market economy. And you can see here the monopolies from the Harut newspaper. There are monopolies in Israel. They devour everything. They control consumption, all the imports, export, and so on. And you can see here the picture of the government eating from the taxes of the citizens and so on, and then come labor and actually take the milk of the government, of the taxes, and bring it to their monopolies. Here it's written Solel Boneh and Hamashbir, and actually in those years, you can't imagine it today, but almost in every field there was a monopoly that was controlled either by the working union or by the government. Stores, there was the Mashbir LaTzarchan, that until today we have a Mashbir. It was a store that was by the working union. Solel Boneh was by the working union. Banks, trains, everything, actually almost 70 to 80%. And this was one of their flags. Taxes, of course, the Harut said that we must cut on the taxes. One of my favorite posters of the party that you can see here, the Israeli citizen enter, it's called the Israeli striptease in the cabaret of Levi Eshkol. Levi Eshkol was then the Ministry of Finance, later became Prime Minister, and you can see here the Israeli striptease, as they call it, that the citizen arrives and he pay like city taxes, and they pay business taxes, and afterward another unified tax and defense tax and custom and belu and all kinds of other luxury tax that used to be in Israel, and the income tax and so on. And then after he is without any clothes, he got this certificate of a model citizen. And this is how Harut saw the big burden of taxes. And first of all, they had a fundamental approach against taxes, because they thought that if you are working and you are getting your pay, it's you earned it, and nobody has the right to take it from you, any part. And the second of all, of course, tactical. They know that a lot of taxes mean a big government that can intervene in the market, and this was also something that they were against. So this is their approach. You can see very much against those taxes. And we have to say that there were a lot of taxes in those times, that the main aim was to harm the rich people or the people with capital in Israel. There was travel taxes, and there was luxury taxes, and there were all kinds of taxes that were here in order to try to, I would say, to bring the different sides, the gap, to shorten the gap between the rich and the poor by, instead of taking up the poor, by reducing the money of the rich. So this was also against, you can see here, taxes. There was a very big issue in those times of the right wing, the Harut, against labor. I see again Levi Eshkol as the Prime Minister, as the Minister of Finance, as we can see it. before the election and after the election, like Ben-Gurion is hiding before the election and then he jumps out with the taxes afterwards. And we have here even a poster in Yiddish that you can see, Kabbalat Panim, Paranayim Ole, and from the first election, that the new Ole is coming and immediately they jump on him, you must pay tax, you must pay custom and so on. It's a very rare poster that I found just, I think, a year ago. Bureaucracy, also a main issue, and the Cherut ideology. They saw the bureaucracy, as you can see, like this big black eagle, or I would say, I think it's an eagle, like poaching against this Israel, which is like the citizen, which is tied, and Ben-Gurion is like leading the whole thing, but the importance of fighting the bureaucracy, the big bureaucracy of a lot of government branches. There were also double branches, like there was a branch of Tzopik Aliyah in the government and in the Jewish agency and there and so on. So it was a big struggle for Cherut against bureaucracy. And also, as I said, as you can see, it was like the key for your career is having this red card that I brought it in order that you will see. I found a picture of one of those red card that actually, it's also a problem that the guy who give you the food, who give you the work, who give you work, actually also wants you to vote for him later. Another thing was very important for Cherut against labor was to stabilize the lira, as they say, stop them. And Cherut has a very, I would say, ideological approach saying, if the government doesn't have money, she doesn't have to spend. She can take loans and actually like taking loans on the account of our future, but if you don't have money, you just don't do other things. Also, again, a fundamental approach, but also a tactical one, because if you don't have a lot of money, don't have a big government. So we spoke about the freedom of the individual, but also another part was representing, I would say, the second Israel. Second Israel is what we call in the academic field, those people mostly came from Arab countries and so on, who lived in very poor neighborhoods and so on, and did not benefit from all of the benefits that the working people that are working in, that have the right connection and have jobs in the state government factories or the working union factories, and they wanted to help them. Menachem Begin used to say, I'm not a right wing, I am a national liberal, because he said, right wing, when I think about right wing economically, I think about someone who wants to take advantage of the workers and so on. So he said, I'm a national liberal. I don't have a lot of time, so I will try to skip some of it, but try to think. But what the Cherut movement ideology was, that we should help by giving the 5 M's of Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky spoke about 5 M's, which is Ma'on, Mazon, Malbush, Moreh, Marpeh, and so on, which is meaning giving, as I said here, the 5 M's, as you can see. And above that, giving them education for those people in order that they will have the best opening point to the free market. Narrowing the social gap through education. I'm jumping ahead. I brought you this picture of the underground fighters who went to the gallows. And I wanted to show you something, because if you look at this picture of those 12 brave young guys who went to the gallows by the British, you can see the names. So you can see one side Feinstein and the other side El Kachri. And you can see Ben Yosef and Betsuri, and you can see Gruner and Dresner, and Kashani and Barazani. So you can see actually already in the underground, in the Etzel underground, that from that came Tnuat HaCherut and the Likud, you can see already the combination between East and West, and between people from different diasporas are coming together, which you couldn't find in Hagana or the Palmach, which were more identified with labor before the state underground, that there were more Ashkenazi Jews. I brought you another sentence that I very like. I found it in one of the center of the Cherut meetings. And there, Menachem Begin instructed the people of the party that they will enter Tel Aviv coalition, the municipality coalition, only if they will be charge of Jaffa, Hatikva, Kerem HaTemanim neighborhood. This is our constituency. This is our destitute neighborhoods and our places of pride. So you can see also, it's not a sentence that he gave for the media or something. This is something he said in a closed meeting that I found later in a protocol. So you can see how he treats those people and the connection between them. I don't have a lot of time and I want to speak about 77, so I will jump over a few things again. But the struggle that the Cherut made, it's not also for those people. They had the struggle for a state pension law, they had the struggle for the state health insurance law, and the struggle for Unemployment Benefits Act. And it's looking a little bit strange when you look at those struggles, because, you know, why does labor is against state pension law? Why is labor against state health insurance law? Why was labor against Unemployment Benefit Act, that we were one of the last countries in the West that actually had this Unemployment Benefit Act? And that's why, because labor had its own big organization who gave pension to its workers and who gave health insurance by Kupat Cholim Klalit, as we know him until today, which is the biggest health, I would say, organization in Israel until today, and it was a part of the working union. So this was very important tools, political tools, for bringing supporters to those organizations and then becoming them political supporters. And the Cherut movement fought in the Knesset, unsuccessfully, I have to say, in order that also those things, those benefits will come also for what we call the Second Israel, to help those people who were, didn't enjoy those things. So we are arriving at the 1977 Ma'apach, the turnover. And I wanted to show this picture. And I think this picture shows, in one picture, I can express the meaning of this turnover. On right, in black and white, we have, for instance, the Minister of Finance. You know, we have those after the election, there is this time that the new minister arrives and the old minister greets him, and they are doing this transaction of power. And so on the right, we have Yoshua Rabinovich in black and white, who was the former Minister of Finance during labor. And he, for instance, he came from the working union. He was in charge of the cooperative, all kinds of cooperative store of the working union. And he gave the keys of the Ministry of Finance to Tzimcha Ehrlich on the left, who was a businessman who had a factory for optics and all kinds of glasses and so on. And if we're going one line down, we can see here Shlomo Rosen, who was the Minister of Building. And he came from the kibbutz. He was the secretary of the kibbutz Artzi. He was in charge of the financing of the kibbutz, was of course cooperative and you know, equality for all and so on. And he gave the keys to Gideon Pat, who came from a family of jewelries and had factories of diamonds and so on. And he got his education in New York University, where he learned about, you know, the importance of incomes and the importance of profits and so on. And the Minister of Energy, for instance, is Yitzhak Modai, who also came from a family. He was the CEO of Revlon International Factory in Israel, and he learned in London, in the London University. So you can see the difference between the former labor regime, who came from the working union and from the kibbutz, to the new, all of those ministers are also from the labor faction of the Likud, who were also for free market and so on. And you can see the difference in mind, it shows you. And of course, there is the important, they declare about this turnover in the economic policy already in October, a few months after the election. And this was a really dramatic act And the working union went against it. And you can see Milton Friedman saying this was one of the biggest thing ever happened to Israel since the day it was established. He said, I recommended this plan years ago, but I didn't believe that there is any government that can show herself able politically to do such a thing. And we'll see what they did. So the first thing was really actually cutting bureaucracy. I brought you the speech of the Deputy Minister of Finance, who's saying the new government has cut down the administrative mechanism by approximately 1,300 workers. Afterward, they say approximately 50% of the workers overseeing foreign currency were subjected to a transfer to other places. There is a government decision to freeze all administrative workers. So you can see actually starting to speak about the bureaucracy, not from the opposition, but this time from the Ministry of Finance itself, and the importance of cutting the bureaucracy, that the big government is not the solution, but actually is the problem, as we used to say, privatization. You can see here the declaration of the government saying every government company, which is not dealing with sensitive security issues or obligate to provide this very important, something important. In any case, should be sell or transferring to was examined. As you can see here, that this was a very important declaration by also in the Deputy Minister of Finance, saying that we are going to sell whatever company that we can. And it was the problem because most of the companies in Israel, the working union companies, the industries and so on, didn't earn money. Usually they enjoyed subsidized from the government. They usually enjoy taxes that prevented from bringing export that could jeopardize them. So there wasn't such a big line of people who wanted to buy those factories, that they know that there are workers there that are enjoying the support of the working union. Was very strong in Israel. One strike of the working union could bring the country to a halt. And so there weren't so many people who wants to buy, but we can see here what they did sell. They sell mostly the banks. They sell banks Fachot. As we know until today, it's the main bank that give loans for buying houses and so on. And they sell it to the Mizrahi Bank. The Bank of Melacha also was sent to the International Bank for 100 million Israeli lira. And that means that the government saw those banks as interfering the market, the free market, because the Bank of Melacha gave loans not in the rate that they were in the market, but special loans for different entrepreneurs to open their I would say, other factories and so on, and also in giving other loans, because they thought that the free market should decide and the government shouldn't interfere the free market by deciding we will give those people different loan than other, and so on. Cancellation of taxes. One of the most hated taxes in Israel was the travel tax that used to be. I remember that when I went with my family abroad, we used to, after buying the ticket, you used to go to the bank or to a post office and pay this travel tax. It was about $50. It was quite, in those times, $50 was a big sum for one person. Thinking if you have a family of 5 people going to abroad, you have to pay $250. And then you can also a certain percentage of the ticket price. And this was the very hated taxes from the beginning. And from the beginning when it was introduced in order to take money from rich people who can go abroad. And the Likud government actually canceled it. Amendment of the law in order to encourage capital investment. As you can see, Begin, I brought here a sentence by Begin that say, I announce that this government doesn't regard industrials as exploiters, but rather builders of the country. And he said it in one of these first events as prime minister, and there were all the leaders of the working union and other people. And it was very important because until then, the motto of the government, that the builders of the country were the workers. And for the first time, the prime minister saying, no, the builder of the country, as I see it, is the people who are the industrialists, who are building factories, who are building Israel all over. And this was very important also for the public. And you can see here that they increased 20% of the sum of the investment by the government. Company taxes went down from 40% to 30%. The tax on profit requiring income tax went down from 45% to only 15%. That's mean to encourage the industry and the industrials in order to help them. Canceling the inheritance tax. You can see here an ad saying that they are closing the offices of the inheritance tax because they actually canceled this tax. And this was also a tax that the Herut movement from the beginning of the state really hated, because they saw it's like a double tax. You pay tax all your life, and then when you want to inherit your children, your money, again, there is another tax of the government, and this was a very important tax that was here for many years until in 1980 it was canceled. Commercial TV channel, the plan for Channel 2 for a commercial TV channel was introduced, the plan, and it didn't happen during the Begin time, but it became later. But think about it, the commercial TV and canceling the eraser. This is a very important example. People I don't know who were here in 77, but for instance, the government didn't want that there will be a gap between those people who have color TV and those people who doesn't have the money and has black and white TV. So they had this thing that erased the colors that was introduced or broadcast from the television in Israel. And so the Israelis had this, the Jewish mind thought about something which called anti-eraser that costs 4,000 lira. I bought this article, and they like introducing back the colors and so on. And the Likud government said, with all due respect, we should also have colors. Jordan had color TV, Lebanon had color TV. We can also have color TV and cancel this eraser and reduce the taxes on color television sets. So it didn't help, it didn't mind the gap so much. There was a guaranteed linkage. This was the thing that the working union factories borrow money from the pension, from all of the pension companies, and the government actually guaranteed the money. And so actually a lot of the money from the public by taxes went to support the working union factories and to hold them. And after they canceled this arrangement, it's really undermined those factories and helped privatizing them. But I think I would say that the big victory was in 1985, after in the unity government, when Shimon Peres, head of labor, introduced in 1985, after the big inflation rates that was in Israel, a plan that spoke about free market, about working union, also coming in and helping in this program. And I would say that I looked over labor, all kind of the labor publication and so on, and party platform and so on. And you can see how until 77, labor only speaks about socialism. It spoke about Israeli socialism, about open socialism, democratic socialism. From 77 onward, after Milton Friedman and Begin and so on, labor started to speak about capitalism. They speak about organized capitalism, centralized capitalism, democratic capitalism, all kinds of different phrases, but they are also adopting their opponents' I would say political jargon or economical jargon. This was very important, and actually in 85, this is, I would say, the highest of this process of even labor understanding that this situation of owning the government, owning factories, the working union refinery must stop, and they are going to another way. Now we're going to speak about the second Israel, what we spoke about before. three important projects: Project Renewal, the free secondary school education law, and income support law. And Project Renewal, I don't know how many of you know that, but in 77, the government bring this project, this important plan of helping the poor neighborhoods, bringing them almost 1.2 billion shekels in helping almost 82 urban neighborhoods and so on. And it was very important because in those neighborhoods, if anybody knows Salah Shabati movie or Don Leon movie or Casablanca movie, old movies, you can see how those neighbors look. They look like very stuffed slums. I would say there are no basketball place to play, no gardens, no nothing. And for the first time, the people who lived there suddenly saw their houses being bigger, look better. It's also improved their self-esteem. And it was also social renewal, not only just building, but there was also fighting drugs and helping them achieve an education and achieving work. Free high school law until 77. It cost money for high school, and this also prevented a lot of people from learning, and it was abolished. And of course, the income Act. A second, I moved it a bit wrong. Right. So actually, the aim of this law was actually to guarantee subsistence income to each individual and family. What we spoke about, the 5 M's of Jabotinsky, of giving everybody health and giving them food and giving them worthy clothes and so on. So this was the income support law that gave everybody kind of this support from. And I brought you somebody, one of the professors in Israel, who are saying for the first time, the change that happened, Social Security looks after us from birth to death. And he says that it's surprising that it's just a paradox that after the Likud comes to power, this is what happens. That's, I will jump on and that I want to find is social balance. So again, what I spoke about, those 3 projects: Project Renewal Neighborhood, record living condition from 1.7 person per room to 1.2, reducing the number, also shortening the gaps between Africa and Asia children to European children who born from European families, and income support law, who actually gave, I would say, a lot of the government money to those poor neighborhoods and people. About the government, so we spoke about the physical, I would say, revolution, but also there was, I would say, something as the conscious revolution, because this is the first government, and in the first government, so I said, this is the first government in the history of the state without a minister from the kibbutz movement, but with a representative from the development town, which was David Levy, who came from Bet Shean. And when Begin put his government, he had 3 ministers that he could appoint, because the rest of the ministers came from other parties and also from other factions in the Likud. The Likud was not as we know it today as one party, but it was a federative political body that was the liberal faction, there was the Herut faction and other factions. So he had 3 ministers, and he had to nominate Ariel Sharon, who joined with his party to the Likud, and he had to appoint his second in command, Ezer Weizmann. And when he had to appoint the 3rd minister, he preferred David Levy from Bet Shean over Misha Arens, who came in the 8th place, and Yitzhak Shamir, who came in the 6th place, and David Levy, who came only in 11th place in the election in the party center, was jumped to the government because it was so important for Menachem Begin that he will be there as a representative of those layers of society. Another thing was the abolishing of what's called the police office and the welfare or as you call it, I don't see the picture. Oh, okay, oh, 1 second. And Saad, the ministry and the police. So the police ministry was very hated in those poor parts of the society. And usually it was only minister that comes from African country, Jews that came from African country or from Arab countries. We can see here Bachor Shalom Shitrit, we can see here Shlomo Hillel, we can see here Sasson. All of the time in every government that labor headed, the minister in this police office was appointed from those diaspora. And we remember the police against the Black Panthers and Wadi Salib riots and so on. And also Saad, there was the Saad office, which means like charity office, which became a welfare and working office, which was also very important to Begin. We are arriving almost to the end. And we can see another important thing was the struggle for the presidency. In 78, the president, Ephraim Katzir, that you can see him in the middle, decided that he is not going to another term. In those times, the president in Israel was elected twice for 5 years. So after the first 5 years, Ephraim Katzir, that was the member of labor, said to Begin that he wants to return to the academy where he was a professor of chemistry. And Menachem Begin said, thank you very much. And he is declared that he wants, at the first time, that there will be a president from what we call the second Israel, from either that was born either in an Arab country or in Africa, and not like an Ashkenazi president again, because he saw about this vision of, the Ashkenaz hegemony of the society, and he wants to show that in this very, important role in Israeli until today society, we look at the president as the #1 citizens, the most important citizens, and the man that we all look to, and so on. And he said no. And although the liberal faction wanted to elect, their nomination was Elimelech Rimlet on the left, that I bought his picture, who had almost all the votes of the coalition, and he could be elected very easily. Menachem Begin said, no, I am not going with you. I want a Sephardic president. And he went to Professor Shabeh. He bought a professor that was born in Syria, and it was very important to him. And what Labor did is that they put Tzchak Navon, that was also Sephardi Jews, and he was elected. And they actually took advantage of this position and those, what happened in the Likud, that the Likud actually break into 2 camps and couldn't vote on one leader. And Begin actually lost a very important position because the president decided who will have the first term in trying to achieve a coalition. So even this was the price. He decided, I want to see a Sephardic Jew in Rehavia in the president's house. And this is what happened, Yitzhak Navon to be elected. And the last thing, I brought a picture of Dudu Topaz. Dudu Topaz, in one of the most famous rallies in '81, said that the people of the Likud, people who are voting for the Likud, doesn't go to the army, and they are what he called chachchachim, was an insult that they use to the second people, Jews that comes from like Arab countries and speak like chukchakdak. So it was like an insult that he insulted them in a big rally of the labor, like the rally that ended the whole campaign in '81. And he said the voters of the Likud, the supporters of the Likud, they don't go to the army. And if they are going to the army, they are those people who are open the gates of the camp and closing it. So they're like their job in the army is so not important. And this was actually, if you look from a bigger perspective, you can understand that this was an attack on being an Israeli. What it means to be an Israeli, especially in those times, but I think even today, Israeli is like the fighter who go to a combat unit in the army and support and fights and so on. This is the hero of our societies. And Menachem Begin understood it. And when he had to appoint the chief of staff of the army, the man who was leading our army, and he had those 4 candidates. He had Janusz Ben-Gal, and he had Rory from Tel Aviv, from a family well known and very rich, powerful family. And we had the Dan Shomron from the kibbutz and so on. he decided to appoint Moshe Levy. Here you can see him on the right, on down to the right. Moshe Levy, who was born in Iraq. His family had owned some small store in the market in Tel Aviv at Shuk HaTikva. And they had like a small, it wasn't even the store, it was more like a table with clothes. And he decided that he will be the chief of staff of our army and not one of those three. Even that his military skills, usually the people didn't thought that he will decide about him, because he used to be in the, most of his time in the Eastern Front with Jordan, that from 67 didn't had a lot of combat activity. But he decided he wants him, he wants Moshe Levy, and appointed him to the chief of staff. And I have here the last, my last thing here is the letter that Ben Gurion wrote. And it's a very important letter, a lot of people in Israel know him. And he says that he still waits to a president or a chief of staff from our brother, the Jews that came from Yemen. And this chief of staff that comes from Yemenite Jews used to be a very important phrase in Israel, because the Yemenite Jews were the most traditional, you know, they came to the country with 2 wives and they were very religious and they weren't so modern and so on. And when Ben-Gurion used to say that he hopes that one day there will be a chief of staff that Yemenite or a president who are Yemenite, that means that this will be like the end of the melting pot and everybody like will be equal and so on. Actually, Ben-Gurion wrote it, but Begin fulfilled it in 77, not a Yemenite Jew, but a Sephardic Jew in the president house and a Sephardic Jew that is heading the IDF. So if I want to sum those things up, I would say that there was, as you can see, 77 was a very crucial time in the history of our state, especially economically and in social justice. And I think that what he did in 4 to 6 years was really a revolution. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Moshe. Okay, I'm going to, if you can, Moshe, turn off the share screen and we'll see your face instead. I'm going to, before going to questions, just a couple of comments and a question for you. Firstly, it's really interesting, you know, I mean, I'm too young to remember all this I was born after Begin was elected, and I made Aliyah a long time after all of this happened. But I had some interesting messages from my father-in-law, who made Aliyah in 1971. And I want to just read out a couple of things that he said, which I think really, really managed to sort of emphasize the point you're making about what Israel was like before this revolution. Because I think, you know, for someone like me, I never experienced it. And I think even for people maybe who are a bit older than me, as this is a group of English speakers who I think in almost every case were not born here, even the older ones among you maybe weren't living in Israel when it was like this. And I think this is really quite revealing. So he mentions that when he came to Israel, it took 2 years to get a phone line, and no one could buy a vehicle with more than 7 seats. So his boss came on Aliyah with 9 children, and he had to go to court to be allowed to import a car that could hold his family. This was the sort of the situation in a very sort of tightly controlled, as you said, Moshe. You know, we think of Israel as a democratic state, and thank God it more or less has been since 48. But it had that model, which is kind of, you know, as close as you can get to the Soviet Union without actually going into communism. And he also mentioned that because you couldn't import a bus to compete with Egged, because Egged was the state bus company. So they used to convert trucks into passenger into passenger buses with just putting benches inside trucks, which sounds completely crazy. But I think it's a good, it paints a little picture of what you were talking about. I just wanted to emphasize something you said, because you made that comparison at the beginning, which obviously makes sense in terms of the when it happened in the end of the 70s, early 80s with Thatcher and Reagan. But one of the critical differences, I think, is that Americans and Brits see the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions as also being a cutting back on social welfare, which didn't happen in Israel. It was this very strange situation in Israel where the introduction of a free market government and a more capitalist economy came with reforms which benefited the poor in Israeli society. And I think that's really interesting. And the critical thing you said about the Jabotinsky's five mems, I just think it's worth mentioning again for those that aren't familiar with this. It's really because Jabotinsky was so critical to Begin's thinking, and those of you who have been with this Wednesday night session for a long time may remember me talking about this about 3 months ago. But I might get some of these wrong, so Moshe will correct me. But Malbush, Marpeh, Mazon, Ma'on, and Moreh, clothing, health, housing, food, and education. 5 fundamental rights, right? That Jabotinsky saw as rights that everyone had to have, which is not something you think of when you think of right-wing free market governments, at least in the Western imagination. Would you think that's fair, Moshe, to make that difference that difference with Reagan and Thatcher?
Yes, and I think this is a very important difference, and I think that we have to bear in mind that in those times, until 77, those people who benefits, who got this Malbush, Moreh, so they got the education and they got the support, they were only those people who worked in the government factories or work in the working union factories. And because it wasn't like a national right, actually, it was the rights of the people who worked for. And if you are working in those plants, you got it from those plants. You got it from the Kupat Cholim Klalit. You got the pension from the factory, you got everything. And they actually prevented it from the other people who didn't have this luck in order to get a job in those factories. So yes, and this was the importance that they want to change it. And this also broke a lot of the power of the working union and the labor. This is what happened, that from 77, labor is also decreasing by numbers and sits in the Knesset. I think it was an important factor. And also you have to remember that really the importance is conscious. That means that until 77, 1st of May, for instance, what we call the worker day, almost all the country was like, they closed most of the country, and there were big rallies, and there were like Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin used to walk hand in hand with the red flag in the center of Tel Aviv, and after them a big rally of people, and this was really a change. This really changed the things.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to a couple of questions that we've had.
Okay.
One is kind of bringing us up to date with Israel today, and it's talking about how in Israel today there is a big gap between rich and poor. One of the biggest gaps in the West. And the question is, what happened? Did policies change? Did priorities change? Was the way that the free market was looked at, was it different under future Likud or other governments?
Well, I think that a lot of what happened in 77, out of those big social reforms, were abandoned after a lot of years. For instance, Project Renewal. So I spoke with some people who lived in those neighborhoods. So they mean, yes, those populations that used to live there in 77 and got the support of the government, the social renewal, helping them to find a job, to get education and so on, left those poor neighborhoods And by not continuing with this project, for instance, so there were new population entering those neighborhoods, and they are still there. So yes, I think that there was, I think the Likud became later more and more free market, and I think this has also helped increase the gap that we can see even today. I think like the Likud saw itself in '77 really as a national liberal party. And if you are a national liberal, they saw themselves economically, I mean. And you saw yourself as the importance of the community, of the national community in helping them. And I think today, economically, only economically, I mean, the Likud is more seen as a more right-wing Republican model of a party and so on. And this part of the party increased its power since it was, I think that in '77, there was a big part of the party that was, I would say, they were national from the terms of Judea and Samaria and so on, but they were quite, had this very big social aspects like David Levy, like Moshe Katsav, like David Magen, Ovadia Ali, Silvan Shalom, and other people that I think today, you don't see those people in the party.
Right. Right. Maybe someone like Moshe Kachlon was to some extent when he was
yes, and I think that Moshe Kachlon deciding to also to leave the party and deciding to have, you can see especially Moshe Kachlon is a very good example because he was a boy in a project Renewal neighborhoods, and he once spoke about it, that how this project helped him and how he can't forget it from Menachem Begin and what he did later as the Minister of Building and so on. With all of his program and so on was actually started there from this ideology. And that he thought that he had to leave the Likud and it would be helpful to him to do it from another party. Yes, also David Levy left the party with Gesher afterward, his daughter and so on. So yes, it's a very good example, Moshe Kachlon, if we think about it.
Okay, there's a question here, which is it's quite a broad question, but see what you think. The question is, do you think that Israel's move from socialism to capitalism after '77 and then Thatcherism and Reaganism also led to or helped lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union?
Well, I think that it's really helped, I think, to sharpen the ideology and also to put this mirror in front of the Soviet Union, of the West that is really obliged to free market, that saw this fundamental ideology of capitalism and so on. I think, yes, in many manners, I think Reagan and Thatcher and really had being so committed for free market, I think you're also committed to fight more the Soviet Union. And we know Reagan with his plans, and we know Thatcher's strong stands against the Soviet Union and so on. So yes, I think it really helped this revolution in all the fields.
One more question that I have: were there some problems? Because without knowing too much about it, you'd think if you are introducing new social programs and also cutting taxes, then there could be a budget problem. There could be a budget deficit, or you could run into financial problems. Did that happen? Was it addressed?
Yes, well, I didn't mention it in my lecture because I didn't have a lot of time. But yes, the inflation was actually it was such a big inflation of hundreds of percent that became, first of all, because for the first time the Israeli lira, later the shekel, as I said, became like its real value. The government didn't decide what would be the value of the lira in front of the dollar or the Deutsche Mark or other currencies. And suddenly when the value of the lira is falling, of course, there's a big inflation. And as you mentioned it, I think mostly in Aridor time, Aridor was the third minister of finance that was in power since the 80s. And especially during Aridor time, that he also tried to help. And when you do those big social projects like Project Renewal and so on, you have to print a lot of money. And on the other side, you reduce the taxes. So you reduce the income that you get. So yes, you had to really print a lot of money, and inflation was really high. And of course, there was also the Lebanon War. We can't forget it in 1982. It also was a big burden on the Israeli economy. And it's also had a big impact on the economy and the inflation. And only in 85, and also you have to remember that the working union was very against any prospect of coming through with the government and doing like a program in order to cut the salaries, in order to help with other things that they needed to know all kinds of other things. And only in 85, after Shimon Peres became the prime minister with Yitzhak Mudai from the Likud as Minister of Finance, we can arrive to this program of stabilizing the Israeli lira. And also, so yes, it was a very, I would say, bad time economically. The banks collapses, some of the banks because of the inflation, and the government had to go over time during the time of Yitzhak Shamir. There was even a time that we fought with the Reagan presidency to make the dollar the currency of Israel. And this was also a plan by Aridor that was almost being introduced. There was already the agreement of Reagan to give us the amount number and to take the shekel away and starting using the dollar here as the Israeli currency. But when Shamir entered the government and Begin resigned, Shamir just put the veto on it and Aridor resigned, but it was almost there.
When you mentioned about Peres and this sort of as it was written in the text, you know, he was the leader of the Labour Party and also I think at the time vice president of the Socialist International, right. You know, and this long time a Painik, and here he was sort of embracing the free market. It reminded me a little of in Britain of how, you know, Tony Blair made Labour electable again by essentially accepting a lot of the Thatcher reforms and you know turning Labour into a party that could no longer be seen as an anti-capitalist party. Also, I think Clinton, when the Democrats came back in America, he said the era of big government is over, right? That the Democrats were no longer going to be the party of big government. It's the success of a party when it forces the opposition to also transform themselves. Okay, I don't think there's more questions, so I think we're going to end here. And I want to thank you, Moshe, very much for joining us this evening and giving us the benefit of your insights and your wisdom. And you've educated us about a hugely important and really not well known enough moment in Israeli history, which changed Israel dramatically and I think forever in that period from 77. So thank you very much, Moshe. I'm applauding everyone else. You won't be able to hear them because their mics are off, but I'm getting messages on the chat to thank you on behalf of other people. And thank you, participants, for joining me. Next week we'll have another of these lectures on the events that shaped Israel. We also have some extra programming on Monday in English related to Sukkot. So those of you on my mailing list, you will get an email from me. If you're not on my mailing list, you can email me at paulg, P-A-U-L-G, @begincenter.org.il. You can also get information on our Facebook page and our English website. So thank you, everyone. I wish you all a good evening, Chag Sameach, and especially this period in our history. Keep well, keep safe and healthy. Bye.